Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Philosophy Friday. It's happy hour, at least for me here. And I'm joined by two of my favorite people to talk to, two returning guests, Dr. Gavin Kerr, Dr. Brian Bisong. We're mostly going to do a Q&A episode. I solicited some questions from members of on my subscriber list. We got a good mix here. So neither of these two have seen these questions, so we're going to play Stump the Professor here. But before we dive in, why don't we just do some brief reintroductions, and who you are, what you do, and we'll get right into it. So, Gavin, how about you go first?
Yeah. So I'm Gavin Kerr. I'm from Belfast. I'm a married father of three, third order Dominican, and I'm engaged in philosophy. I teach philosophy for St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. I'm a graduate of Queen's University Belfast, where I did a BA degree in scholastic philosophy and philosophy, a master's by research on essence and existence in Aquinas, and then a doctorate on Aquinas and Kant, and sort of their convergences and divergences. And since then I've just been researching and publishing on medieval philosophy, modern philosophy, ancient philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophical logic, and I've published a few bits and pieces on Aquinas, and continuing to write and research.
And I'm Brian Bisong. So I'm a married father of two, and I did my PhD at Purdue on the conscience and moral disagreement, and how we should understand what happens when we disagree with peers and with experts. Since then, my research has focused on natural law ethics and moral epistemology more broadly. And this is now my third time on your show, so I feel like it's old hat.
Yeah, no, so that's super interesting, Brian, because I was actually just going over your CV, and I have to admit, embarrassingly, I was somewhat unfamiliar with your original work. But I was just talking to my previous guest, who's a molecular biologist, and one of the questions that I presented him is a very common question. You're dealing with it in ethics, but Gavin, I'd like to get your opinion on this too. So I guess I'll ask the first question in this Q&A. Is just assume that somebody is a non-expert in at least some area, which all of us are, right, to some areas. And experts disagree, right? Maybe it's about God's existence. Maybe it's about this moral commitment. Maybe it's about some aspect of molecular biology. What do we do about that, right? So how can the individual, or can the individual, be empowered and come to a satisfying or at least adequate position when it doesn't seem like, I don't even want to say that there might not be a consensus, because maybe there is a consensus, right? But then maybe there's still other relevant experts who disagree. How do we start to handle a situation like this? What would you say to somebody in a position like that? And you can stay within your fields of expertise, or go general with it, however you want.
Gavin, you want this first, or should I take it?
I don't mind. This was your doctoral work, so you can start.
Well, I'll say that there's no one-size-fits-all rule for how we should handle expert disagreement. It's very difficult. First of all, it's very difficult to assess who are the experts. Because, for instance, in morality, one might think that people with professional credentials are the experts in morality. The problem is that some of the credentialed experts, so-called, are apparently deviating very substantially from what most people consider to be just common sense. So who's the expert? Is Peter Singer the expert? Is Michael Tooley an expert? Is Mother Teresa an expert? It's very hard to know. I obviously have my views that Mother Teresa is going to be more an expert than Peter Singer, say. But supposing that we do discover that there are genuine moral experts, then it can be also tricky to know what we're supposed to do with that. I think that generally speaking, it's safe to exercise an opinion, to hold an opinion that is an expert opinion, even when experts disagree. It gets very complicated. Pat, we talked about this very briefly, about the debates, the scholastic debates over whether it's permissible to act when one moral expert is saying that the course of action is permissible, but there are a larger number of experts who say it's impermissible. And so this gets very, very complicated very quickly.
Yeah. So Gavin, now maybe to metaphysics, right? Because maybe somebody's on the fence between theism and atheism, say,
Yeah.
and they're like, well, Gavin believes in God, but then like some other really smart person like Graham Oppie say, he's an atheist. I don't have the chops to dive down into the weeds of this. So what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah. I suppose my first reaction to that, that presupposes that I'm an expert in metaphysics, and so, somebody should take seriously what I say. And that's not just a trite remark, because I think an expert is somebody who's mastered the relevant literature on a particular issue and is informed to such an extent that they can exercise a judgment on a particular matter, and be sort of safe in their view that the judgment they exercise is more reasonable to their mind than any other reasons offered against their judgment, precisely because of their mastery of the literature. So when it comes to somebody who isn't an expert exercising a judgment in a particular area, first of all, you have to ask, is it prudent for them to exercise a judgment in an area of which they are not an expert? Because not everybody has to exercise a judgment concerning a particular area, because not all sort of issues are quite pressing. I don't need to exercise a judgment, say, over, I don't know, something like molecular biology, because the issues in molecular biology aren't pressing to me. But the question of God's existence is a pressing question to me. It is one of those big existential decisions. And so I can't really exercise a philosophical judgment on that unless I become fully aware of the literature in the area and work through the questions for oneself. So if a non-expert sort of looks at, say, my work and thinks, oh, well, this guy seems to, have read a lot and understood a lot, and he presents a really good case, and then they look at somebody like Oppie and they think something similar is happening there. Well, that person, if they just can't decide, they're going to have to become experts themselves and try to figure things out themselves. So I think in the case of, real pressing sort of questions where you have to make a judgment, you have to, in a sense, become as informed as you can be, so that whatever judgment you do make, you have the best reasons for making it. And I think, pragmatically speaking, that's the best approach to take.
So are we really saying, I mean, at the end of the day, we're really saying, especially on these big pressing questions of life, you're just going to have to roll up your sleeves and get to work?
I think so. I mean, my view would be that if these questions are pressing, like these big metaphysical existential issues, then obviously your mind has been turned to them for some reason or other, in which case, you've opened up a can of worms and you're just going to have to deal with those worms. If you're not the sort of person who has the time or the energy or the inclination to kind of deal with these big existential questions, then they don't really emerge for you. And so the issues aren't pressing in a philosophical sense. So there's no can of worms which is opened with which you have to deal.
Right. Yeah, I have two thoughts on that I'd like to pick your guys' brain about, because I mean, I'm obviously with you in the sense that the questions that have always been the most pressing to me, maybe this is just a aspect of my OCD or whatever, I feel like I do need to kind of drive to the end of the rainbow, if you will. And, when I got there and things like theism and atheism, and I read Mackey and Oppie and Rowe, and then I read the contemporary theists. And at the end of the day, I just think that as intelligent as those atheist scholars are, they get things wrong, right? That they just their project doesn't do it for me, right? I think the theists are right. So that's one thing. Maybe you just can't get around it. Maybe you just have to roll up your sleeves and do the work, and find that point of satisfaction for yourself. But might there be something? This is something I've been thinking, a fair amount about, and I'd be quite curious on your thoughts on this, Brian, on certain moral issues. Could there be like some type of external symmetry breaker in some sense? And Gavin, I know this came up in the last Q&A we did of your thoughts on Pascal's wager, but Pascal's wager is something like that, right? Where properly understood, say that you did kind of roll up your sleeves and you study expert A, you study expert B, you study expert C, you study expert D, and you're still on the fence, right? And you don't know which way to go. Is that when something like Pascal's wager might be useful? Like some independent symmetry breaker that can cause you to go one way rather than another? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And, you know, I don't want to be the odd man out, but I'm not sure that ordinary people should feel obliged to roll up their sleeves. One of the things that weighs on my mind is what ordinary people are likely to think that prevents them from rolling up their sleeves, namely that, well, look, it's not just mastery of the literature, but it's also, say, a brilliant mind that leads to expertise. I don't have the brilliant mind, and I certainly don't have the same amount of time that other people have. And so for me, it suffices, me as this imagined layperson, for me, it suffices to know that there are brilliant people out there, know that they've come to this position, and to have external reasons to support that position. And yeah, I'm familiar with objections against my view, but so is the expert, and he seems to be content that the responses are just as good as the objections. And so I think that sticking with an authority like that is perfectly fine. Although, to the degree that one can roll up one's sleeves, I think it satisfies us, though we shouldn't feel obliged to do that in ordinary life. So there should be other reasons to roll up one's sleeves besides just like a moral obligation.
Right. Yeah, because we obviously can't do it on all matters, not even all matters that I think are important to us. I don't even know if that would be possible, because there's obviously some matters that are of higher importance than others, but there's a lot of things that are genuinely.
Which makes it sort of like perennial Pascal's wager in every area of life. And so those external constraints seem to apply to like nearly everything.
Right. So in terms of like other independent or external considerations, yeah, you could I guess weigh the pros and cons. If I go this way rather than that, what do I have to gain versus what do I have to lose, right? What about something like common sense or intuition? Is that something that you guys would kind of throw into the mix as maybe a tiebreaker or something? Brian, I've read some of your work on
love intuition, common sense.
Mm-hmm.
G. Moore, Reed. I'm a big fan. Gavin, I'm curious your views.
I suppose to clarify my initial point, when I talk about the ordinary person having to roll up their sleeves, I suppose the clarification is that once these, big issues become pressing for them, they're no longer an ordinary person. They've entered on the weird and wonderful world of philosophy. So they cease to be the ordinary person precisely because their intellect has turned. They've kind of, they've glimpsed outside the cave, and, that's when a kind of a moral imperative is placed on them that, they've seen something of the life outside the cave, and, they kind of need to stick with that rather than go back into the cave. So once these pressing issues start to become pressing for them, that they're no longer an ordinary person and they do have to roll up their sleeves. And with that in mind, yeah.
I think that right now we're actually creating something of the same conundrum of expert disagreement for the listeners of Pat's podcast. Because on the one hand, they might think to themselves, well, look, I satisfy Gavin's description precisely. Do I have to exit the cave? And then on the other hand, Brian says that you can stay in the cave as long as you sort of tag along with Socrates leaving it, or just trust what he has to say after having come back. That's
hilarious.
For better or worse.
Yeah, there's actually a question coming up. I'll save it for later about something we disagree on. It seems like we might already be there. So yeah, there's your expert opinion. Three different opinions. But I guess there's another lesson there, is that maybe there's, and I don't want to make it seem like this is always the case, because clearly experts just very obviously disagree strongly and there's no reconciliation. But at least between what you two have said, I don't know if your answers are incompatible. They're just a little bit different, right?
Definitely nuanced.
Right. Yeah. So
yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, this ties into the first question, and this is always a perennial one that comes up. And Gavin, we've talked about this many times, but it's a little bit different. What and this is unless it specifies, the question is just for the whole roundtable, so we'll all take different swings at it. I'm going to let you guys do most of the talking this episode, because I'm having one of those days where sentences are hard to form, probably because Gavin sent my paper back today and it was just filled with red ink.
Was that today?
Yeah, it was this morning for me. Yes, I've been cranking through that all day, which I super appreciate. But I'll let you guys do most of the heavy lifting. What role do you think arguments for the existence of God actually play? When I look around on the internet, bad metric, I know, they often don't seem to convince skeptics, even if I personally think some of them should. Additionally, what do you find to be the most convincing arguments or evidence of God, and why? So one, I guess, is sort of a practical concern. The other one is just a personal take.
Who wants to go first?
Gavin, you should go first.
Okay. I suppose I would divide that, sort of my response to that into three. First of all, the initial question, what role do these arguments play strategically in trying to convince others? That's the more apologetical issue. The second, what role do they play for myself? Why would I engage in this? But then I would add in a third sort of caveat, maybe not explicit in the question, is what role do they play in the life of faith of the believer? So specifically, for one who is of the faith, who is faithful. So with regard to the first one, that more apologetic issue, are these sorts of demonstrations for God designed to convince unbelievers? So my 2015 book on the deity argument, is that meant to convince an unbeliever? I don't think so. Because an unbeliever doesn't believe for a whole host of reasons. Not usually philosophical. There's a whole history and a biography there for why a non-believer is a non-believer, and they can point to sort of philosophical trends and views which would reassure them in their non-belief, but that's generally not why they're a non-believer. And unless those more sort of personal issues are addressed by a pastor of souls, somebody who's engaged in care of souls, straight up arguments aren't going to convince a non-believer. What they're there for, and this is my sort of more personal engagement with them, is what the demonstration of God is there for is to establish a truth or a fact of the matter, that God exists, that there is a primary cause. Because to my mind, the whole point of philosophy is to arrive at the truth about whatever issue it is we're considering. It's not to convert unbelievers, although it'd be great. It's great if that does happen. And it's not the kind of, buttress believers who are already convinced, although that does happen and it's great. It's to find out what the truth of the matter is, and to get that out there, and then people can come to that and decide where they're at with that. And then with regard to the life of faith, faith is an interesting thing, because the way I see faith is a particular virtue that one has. And what I mean by virtue is a kind of a habit of mind that one has by which one is disposed to believe things that pertain to God. So you might notice a very Thomistic sort of, glossing on that. So it's a particular virtue by which you're disposed to believe things that pertain to God. You can't be pushed or forced into faith or belief. It's an assent which you make, and thus it has to be willed. But because it pertains to things about God, it's not something that you can will for yourself because you can't see God. Thus, it has to be a grace which God gives by which you're disposed to believe in the things of God. But you can dispose your will in such a way that you don't resist the grace from God in assenting to faith, in receiving the grace through which you have faith. And to do that, you have to fall in love with God, or fall in love with God as the good itself. And once that occurs, the faith, the grace by which you have faith then occurs, and you're disposed to believe these things of God. So it's kind of like, a reliable sort of cognitive habit by which, you believe these true things about God. In the same way that, you fall in love with your spouse, and so you just take what your spouse tells you to be the case, precisely because you have fallen in love with, well, we're all guys here, you have fallen in love with her because she is your spouse, she is your beloved, and so would not deceive you. And it's a similar situation with God then. So that the arguments for the existence of God, the role that they play in the life of faith, is that they predispose you to receiving that grace. Your will doesn't stand contrary or against. You're not opposed to receiving the grace from God. So they're a preamble to receiving the grace by which you can affirm truths about God which you couldn't know otherwise.
Brian, you want to hop in?
I'm so glad I said Gavin should go first here.
Right.
because I agree with nearly everything that Gavin has just said, and I couldn't have said it much better, and I would have left out significant portions of what he just said. So, I might add that I'm a little bit more sanguine about the social value of arguments for God. But I think that Gavin's right to point out that often disbelief in God, which I would distinguish from as just sort of absence of belief, but believing that God doesn't exist or being resistant to the arguments about God, most often I've experienced it to be a sort of stubbornness. And that stubbornness is not explained often by reason, but by moral and psychological experiences that people have. So, like in my experience, and this is not to pigeonhole people, in my experience, people who are raised non-religious are often agnostics as teenagers and college students. And people who are raised religious in either dogmatic homes or homes where maybe there were moral problems going on, those are the people who most often end up atheist. And it's not every down to a man, but that's what I've experienced. And so I think that arguments for God's existence, including cosmological arguments like what we see in Aquinas, are successful, especially for the sort of non-belief that doesn't come from like the sort of the atheist story, the characteristic atheist story. I think people who, in my experience teaching undergraduates, I think the first way argument is successful for agnostic college students. In my experience, though, the most successful the most successful argument persuading people is a fine-tuning argument. Teleological arguments, in my experience, are massively powerful for persuading college students.
Right. Yeah.
Does that make them better arguments? I don't know. It's a tricky question when Gavin says that the arguments are designed for demonstration to get at the truth of the matter. And the skeptic will say, well, in what sense is it a demonstration if it doesn't persuade me? And so there are these tricky questions about what counts as a demonstration and how persuasive should it be. Certainly, we don't want to make the bar so high that it's only a demonstration if it persuades everybody, no matter how stubborn. But socially, this can get tricky because we often press back saying, well, look, this is not a sort of sincere disbelief. You're not being open-minded. And a person wants to say, well, of course I'm being open-minded. You don't know me.
It's I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because it actually echoes my experience. And this was something I had to adjust my expectations over because, after I sort of converted and I was going through my conversion process, and I was somebody who was convinced by the arguments. So I just thought anybody will be convinced by I was convinced by them. Everybody else will be convinced by them. I'll cure the world of atheism. We see how that's gone, right? And what I've realized is exactly what you've said, that my period of atheism was not because I was rebelling against a religious upbringing that was traumatic to me or abusive or that I felt was morally problematic. And I was brought up really in a was so nominally religious a household that it was virtually agnostic, right? And then I get met with the kind of contemporary secular challenges. I get introduced to philosophy through thinkers like Nietzsche, and I just kind of assume this atheism, right? But my disposition was always, I just want to know the truth about things, right? That was my disposition. And so when I keep going deeper into naturalism, and I think, I don't think this is going to work, right? And then I go back and I reevaluate, and I discover natural theology, and I read stuff. And I try and learn things and all that. And I become convinced. What I realize is that is not, and people are going to get triggered about this. That's fine. You hit the thumbs down if you really need to. That's just not the disposition of a lot of atheists. It just isn't. No matter what they say, it's not. You're just not being honest. I don't know how else to phrase it, right? There's something else socially, psychologically that's going on. And I'm not saying you're an idiot. I'm not saying you're an idiot or a dumb person if you don't accept the arguments, but there's just more to the story. And I think that's kind of what you're picking out, Brian, right?
Gavin's metaphor about rolling up one's sleeve, in my experience in this context, often involves the atheists rolling up their sleeves to get into a fight.
Right. So, I think that's something where I've really had to reflect and realize that, okay, my experience is not necessarily the typical experience. And just because I went from atheism to theism because of these arguments doesn't mean that most people will, or even many people will. And, since I've written on this and done the podcast, people have called me an apologist. I really resist that term. I don't think of myself. That isn't what I like to have people on. I like to talk about things, and it often it just involves philosophy. I've never thought of myself as I'm not somebody who just goes and studies the apologetic issues so I can answer every objection. That's just not what I do. Right. So I think, yeah, what's the practical use? I think it's useful because it can plant seeds, and that's how it was for me too. Like, it wasn't like I encountered one argument and then, suddenly I believe in God, and it's sort of a gradual thing, right? That develops over time, that at first piques your interest, and then you want to go more, and then you read some objections, and then this is the process of rolling up your sleeves, right? And just trying, I guess, to drive it to the end of the rainbow. As far as favorite argument, yeah, I would say the general class of cosmological arguments were most convincing for me. But Brian, you're also right, is that when you talk to, like, I guess, more of a popular audience, what I think are the best arguments are typically not the most either interesting or persuasive to people. Right?
Popular metaphysics is just really hard, and it feels like sleight of hand for a lot of people. And so when you point out mathematical improbabilities and they're deeply wedded to the best science, people trust science. People know what numbers are. It doesn't feel like there's any room for sleight of hand in a way where the first way argument, which I find compelling, and it's worth mentioning. I don't know if y'all have ever read William James on the varieties of religious experience, but he is so dismissive of the scholastic arguments for God's existence. I think he even goes so far as to say that no one ever at any point has been persuaded by the cosmological arguments. Which of course is demonstrably false, but it I think in practical experience it's true that their conversion stories after seeing the first way or cosmological arguments are far more rare than other arguments.
I suppose the reason for that is because those sorts of arguments, first way or the de ente argument, or any of the five ways, they're part of what in Thomas, what you would call a general scientific method. They come along as part of a systematic engagement with the issues. They're not apologetical in nature. So they're there to demonstrate the subject matter of, say, theology, i.e., God's existence. That's why they're so difficult, so abstract, and just so unengaged with trying to convince somebody, because Thomas did his convincing of people for the existence of God and truths about God as a Dominican preacher. He did that from the pulpit and the confession box, not from the theology lectern.
So if anybody wants to hear these arguments or you want to study them, obviously Gavin has two fantastic books out. Sorry, my camera's cutting out, but I'm still here. And we'll link both of those in the show notes. And then, of course, all of our million other episodes that we've done at this point, arguing essence and existence. We did that huge series on the 5 ways. So I'll link all those in the show notes so people can go get caught up on all that. Okay. Next question. This one's kind of interesting. I'm really, I'd be really curious to hear both of your response to this. Intellectually, what was the most difficult question you ever wrestled with that was also of significant importance to your life? Maybe faith related, maybe not. Did you arrive at a satisfying answer? And what happens if you don't?
I've got my answer already.
Oh, Gavin, you got to start because I need time to think.
This is a good one. This is a
yeah. I suppose it's two related issues. The first was coming to terms with Cartesianism and why Descartes was just wrong, because I started my philosophical life with, real severe Cartesian intuitions, and so found Descartes very congenial. And so that was the most difficult in the sense of it was almost like a bad habit or vice that I had to root out of myself, my Cartesianism. So that was difficult. Almost like an alcoholic trying to come to sobriety was me trying to dry out from my Cartesianism. But the most difficult, just straight up problem or challenge was Kant, the Critique of Pure Reason, coming to terms with that. And the way I dealt with it is I wrote my doctorate on it. So that's how I came to terms with that.
That's the best way to do it, right? Just make it.
Yeah, rolling up my sleeves and just getting on with it.
Very cool.
Maybe I've confined myself to philosophical problems that are far easier because, my dissertation, I didn't ever feel like it was, it didn't involve any sort of intellectual crisis. And so, I thought the research was interesting and important, but it didn't involve any weighing of possibly being wrong. Maybe I'm excessively confident. I'd say probably as an intellectual problem, my becoming Catholic was a more existential, sort of life-searching, soul-searching type of decision, and intellectual as well as moral, psychological factors certainly weighed into that. The question of what would happen if you didn't make a decision, I sort of feel like the clock is ticking, and that not making a decision is not an option.
What year did you actually convert, Brian?
2008 was when I was confirmed. So I guess 2007, 2006. I was in RCIA for a year, but I forget exactly when the process began.
Yeah, I noticed that you were on the Coming Home Network. I was on it just here, so I will link to your interview on that. That was a good one.
Thanks.
Yeah. For me, it's got to be predestination. I don't know what's a thornier subject than that one. If only because there's so much that bears in on that question, right? You have to pull from metaphysics. You have to go philosophical anthropology. You have to look at the tradition of the church. You have to pull in biblical. You have to juggle so much at one time to try and start to, and it's also something that so much rides on it too. And there's a reason this has been such a thorny theological topic, because there's such a fine balancing line of how you deal with that issue, where if you go just a little too far to the right or a little too far to the left, you immediately have explosive issues, right? With either God's sovereignty or human freedom or God's goodness and moral intuitions. I don't know if we want to go much further into that, but I will say that was the biggest issue for me. And yes, I did come to a satisfying answer. Thank you. I don't know if it's a correct one, but it satisfied me. So that's that. That's a good one. But I guess with the second part, because it seems like we all answered yes, we did come to a satisfying answer. What happens when you don't? Right? Should that be a huge crisis for people? Right? Because I'm sure you guys get this. My inbox is constantly filled, especially on Instagram, of people who are having. It seems like anytime a question is unanswered for them, they're like, it's an existential crisis. Usually it's a faith related question. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? It's like, I don't know how to answer this. Help me. Right? It's the end. What would be your counsel to somebody in a position like that?
Usually people who are like this in any number of areas. And so they're deeply reflective people, and they feel the reasons weighing on them and pulling on them in a variety of directions. And so I think it's only time and experience that helps. Traditionally the four temperaments, this is characteristic of the so-called melancholic, to weigh all these reasons and to feel unable to come to a judgment or a decision. And so I think the psychological experience and growth is what's really necessary, and it'll make decision making easier. Although there's certainly going to be difficult issues.
I suppose for me, well, there's two things that I should say about that. The first thing is that the really important issues where I really have to make a choice, which are real existential choices. Well, look, at a very young age, I fell in love with God and wanted to be a saint. So God has granted me the gift of faith, and I'm disposed to believe everything, all the truths about God, which the Catholic Church teaches. And so for those real existential issues, I mean, that's that done for me, so any issue after that then any issues after that aren't as pressing. And so I know I can sit down and take my time and think them through and, go to the different philosophers and different resources and come to terms with a particular issue. So, but when it comes to the real pressing life and death sort of stuff, I mean, I've already assented to everything that the Catholic Church believes, and my philosophical life from that has just confirmed all of it. So other issues such as Kant's transcendental idealism or Hume's fork or, Quine and his two dogmas of empiricism, well, they're not really that serious issues. So I can take my time. And when I'm not making any headway, I can put the books down and close the computer and be with my family and not have to worry about that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. That's good. For all my Instagram followers, listen to that. That's good advice. Here's a fun one. What are everybody's thoughts on reincarnation?
Can I just say metaphysically impossible?
You can. Do you want to? So, I mean, this is fun. This is interesting. Obviously, a good chunk of my audience are not Catholic, but they're open to a lot of different spiritual beliefs. This is something that it's become. It seems like it's definitely becoming more common of karma, reincarnation, especially in the West, of at least a plausible spiritual commitment of some people. So yeah, Gavin, you say there's metaphysical issues with it. What would be some of your?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order to have reincarnation, the self has to be identified with something which is non-bodily. And there's that Cartesianism creeping back in. So it doesn't matter what body that self is found in, so long as that whatever it is that identifies the self is there, then you can hop from body to body just given the right circumstances. And that doesn't even have to be reincarnation of the religious variety. That can be just you get all these sort of crazy situations in analytic philosophy of mind of downloading your thoughts and memories into a machine or whatever like that. It's a similar sort of setup. I think there's metaphysical issues with that precisely because, well, I mean, given the anthropology that I adopt, you have physical substances, they're composites of matter and form, and there's a exclusive distinction between living and non-living substances. And it's not in virtue of their matter that they're distinct, it's in virtue of their form. So living things have a distinct kind of form, which non-living things don't have. And it's that form which makes them alive. And so that's suche or anima or soul. So the soul is the form of the body. So, the soul of a tree is the form by which that tree is a tree and not, a rock. And the soul of a rabbit, the same. The soul of a man is the rational soul. And the rational soul is the form by which that particular material substance is able to have rational life. That involves nutritive and sensitive life, but it also involves rationality as well. And so there's two powers of rationality, intellect and will, which don't depend on a material organ. And this is because intellect and will stand in potency to all things intelligible. And all material things are intelligible. And since intellect and will stand in potency to the intelligibility of all material things, then they can't have the actuality of any material thing. And so they don't depend on a bodily organ. So the soul, which is their bearer, itself then has to be immaterial, given that they are immaterial and it supports them. But yet it's the form of a material body. So whilst body and soul are distinct, the identity conditions of the soul is not the identity conditions of the body. So the persistence conditions of either won't be the same. So if the body corrupts, the soul doesn't corrupt. That doesn't mean the person survives bodily death. Only a part of the person survives bodily death because the person is the physical substance, the living physical substance. So I myself won't survive bodily death. Only my soul or my form will survive bodily death, but that won't be me. That will just be a part of me. So if in some future state that comes to inform another body, well, it's an individuated soul. It's my soul. So that when it forms as a form, when it comes to inform a new body, let's say at the resurrection, it will be my body because it's my soul. And so the body then will be conformed to that soul or will be informed by that soul. And so that's not a reincarnation sort of view. Reincarnation is impossible in this, given that soul is form, because any body that the soul informs will be my body and will be like this body here. Although obviously in the resurrection, that's going to be a glorified body, but still the form of that body is going to be like my body right now.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that.
So that's why it's metaphysically impossible.
Brian, I wonder if there's a moral problem with it too. And I know that there's different theories of reincarnation out there, but something that just kind of comes to the top of my head is one of the ideas behind reincarnation is that you got to have another swing at the moral game, so to speak, right?
Yeah, it seems like people are, although I want to pick at Gavin's answer, but I'll answer this on the moral side first. Not pick at it as a friendly critic, but I also want to say another firm vote for corruptionism, Thomistic corruptionism here. So, but at any rate, yeah. So it seems like a lot of people are adopting karma as both for the fun of it, because it seems fun to think that you're not going to die and be annihilated. It seems more attractive than full annihilationism. And so you think, well, hey, having, sort of continued existence that's attractive. So is karma and reincarnation. Another attractive element in the karma reincarnation idea is a sense of justice in the universe, because we think that it's a sort of automatic process that people get what's coming to them. And it's very unsatisfying to think that the world is, in its most fundamental ways, unjust, so that people don't get what they deserve in the end. That's very unsatisfying. I think it's even more unsatisfying than the idea that we're going to be annihilated. I think, like talking to students, I think more people are attracted by the idea that Hitler's in hell than by the idea that they'll continue to exist after they die in some form or another, that they'll have an afterlife. So as a response to evil, as a response to, the suffering of this life, it seems attractive, but only at first glance, because deeper reflection, and I'm not the first one to point these problems out, but deeper reflection on the idea of retributive karma suggests that we're actually in the right whenever we are cruel, because as a matter of strict necessity, whenever someone suffers, they're suffering for some previous wrongdoing. Now, making someone who's previously done something wrong suffer is not wrong in the same way as making an innocent person suffer. There's also an injustice in this too, because typically we consider it to be a requirement of justice that we're aware of the crime for which we're being punished. And so karma has all the punishment. In fact, we'll participate in the punishment every time we're mean to somebody, but it has none of the restorative value that punishment should take by letting the criminal know that this is, the reason why they're suffering. And so there's the attractive element, especially on the moral side, is deeply flawed. But then, of course, people do want to have an afterlife. And so it seems like for many people, the non-religious version of an afterlife, a no strings attached version of eternal existence.
Right. So this is good because we kind of approached it, from both the metaphysical and the moral. So Brian, you said you wanted to pick at Gavin's response a little bit.
Gavin, my question for you is this: can God make me a woman?
Can God make you a woman? Well, gender would be an inseparable accident of the physical substance that you are. You as a person are that physical substance. So, assuming your gender is male, right? So it's an inseparable accident of the physical substance. Your soul isn't male or female, but you are male or female. Yeah. So, and God has, infused your soul in, a particular physical body with its development that it had. Obviously, God can make you anything. He's omnipotent. Would you be you if you were a woman? Well, you wouldn't be that physical body that you are. So I would say, given that he has made you a man, no, he can't make you a woman.
I had a feeling you'd say that. I'm just curious of the response.
Okay, why did you have a feeling I would say that?
I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm just curious.
I would certainly, sort of oppose. It tends to be the sort of the Stein people and the John Paul II people who think that, that the soul is there's something weightier to it than what I would sort of suggest, that there is something, there's something essential of Gavin in the soul, not just that it's the form of my body, but my very self-identity is there, which would include my being a male, which I don't think is a feature of the soul. I don't think gender is a feature of the soul. But it seems to be the Stein people and the John Paul II people who tend to oppose me on that.
This is like the incommunicability stuff. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's involved in it. Yeah. The personhood is incommunicable because it's utterly unique. From what I understand, the Steinians and the John Paul II people, they locate the uniqueness or the incommunicability in the uniqueness of the immaterial soul. Whereas for me, I locate the uniqueness in the fact that substance, that rational substance, is unique and unrepeatable. So there can never be more than one of me or one of you, because from the moment we come into being, we're not just alive, but we're living a life, which develops into the full-fledged rational life, and that's utterly unique. So I locate the incommunicability more in the hylomorphic characteristics of the rational substance rather than the sort of the morphe side, the form side of things.
You're not going to get any pushback from me. Although the more dualist you go, it seems like the more open to the transgender development one should be, because it seems like the body is more and more a detached Cartesianism.
If my complete self-identity is in my soul and that is sort of out of sync with my body, then all the obvious conclusions flow from that. So are you suggesting that the sort of Steinian and John Paul II views do lend themselves to
not on purpose. Not on purpose.
But so it's just the idea. The more dualistic you go, the closer towards that position you get.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems harder to resist when you think of the body as being an essential part of who I am. Well, then, it's natural to think then that certain key ineliminable features of my body are then part of this ineliminable, Brian B. song. But, the sort of pop dualism that sees the soul as your consciousness, and this consciousness can sort of hop around. The more the body is going to be, this actually seems more popular right now, the idea of downloaded consciousness, the idea of sort of panpsychism and things like that. It seems like this all fits very well with this disembodied personhood.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's just a kind of, a problem with analytic philosophy of mind, that it's, analytic philosophy in general, that it doesn't have a very robust account of hylomorphism. And it's also important to point out, about these sort of features of the physical body, which are essential to me as a person. Gender is one of the examples, and I pointed out that it's an inseparable accident. That is, it's an accident that is inseparable from me. So it's not essential to me being a rational animal. So it's not essential to my rational animality that I'm male or female, but it's inseparable to me as an individual that I developed, either as a male or as a female. So any member of the species develops as one or the other. But there are separable accidents, such as, the beard color or the hair length or stuff like that, which can be separated from me, and I can still be the individual that I am. So we can dispense with those and eliminate those. It's just the inseparable accidents that we can't dispense with.
Yeah, I completely agree. Although, like the critic in me wants to know, because it seems like some of these are a matter of degree. So, for instance, my being bearded is partially a function of a certain amount of, I think it's, I forget, it's like dihydroxytestosterone, DHT, which also is going to make my hair go away one of these days. So, as a matter of degree, I am, say, bearded, and I have certain other gendered physical features, and most of these I think are going to be the ineliminable. But then you think about sex and being male. Now, certainly, Ryan Anderson has this wonderful book on When Harry Became Sally, and
Right.
one of the things he points out is that it seems like nearly every cell of our body is sexed in some way. But isn't this just a matter of degree? That the beardedness is illimitable if I just had less DHT in my body for the last, say, 5-8 years, whereas the other stuff is ineliminable because it affects more, or it's just more difficult to eradicate.
Well, what about orientation towards a certain production of gamete? Would that be a degree thing for you or kind difference, Ryan?
You just lost me.
Right. So the orientation towards a certain kind of reproductive cell, because I see what you're saying in terms of different levels of hormones. I can see how that could be a matter of degree. But then when I think of, say, gametes, reproductive cells, I don't see the degree. I'm actually asking you.
It's a binary feature.
Right.
Yeah. So I suppose maybe what I would want to, say to that, Brian, is that if you do have this binary feature which distinguishes, the one from the other, there are certain consequences, of, having, being on one side of that binary or the other, which follows in the physical development of the body, such as the production of testosterone, which in turn produces, facial hair, and all the rest. And so what follows as a consequence from that are almost like, those properties, that we talk about of the intrinsic nature of the thing, like risability in man. They come as a result of that, but they're not, in a sense, essential to falling down on one side of the binary or the other, but they're the typical consequences given the right circumstances. But having a particular kind of gamete, reproductive gamete, seems to be, a binary feature that you fall down one side or the other, and that's determinative.
Yeah, I like it.
Awesome. Well, that whoever asked that question got their money's worth. So yeah, that was good. But it's important because as much of a hot topic as the whole transgender debate is now, I do think people think it's far more simplistic than it actually is on either side, right? There's deep philosophical considerations that go into this contemporary issue, right? And I think we've just teased maybe a few of those out, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, exactly. I mean, you have thinkers like, Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, addressing these issues in philosophical anthropology, and, any treatment of identity and self-identity is going to have to take account of, is going to espouse a philosophical anthropology consciously or unconsciously. So, it has to be open to going through those issues and seeing where the foundations lie on which side of the debate you stand on.
Right. Okay, next one. Can you guys please talk about the perverted faculty argument? It would be... yep. It's here we are. It would be great if you could show how objections about alleged counterexamples, such as using deodorant or chewing gum, fail. Thank you.
So I'll take this. It seems more directed to natural law.
Yeah. So let's give all the relevant background, assuming that people have never heard even of what a perverted faculty argument is before, if you don't mind.
I've tried to find the history of the phrase, the perverted faculty argument. And as far as I can tell, this is a 20th century phrase only. I think it was put forward first by actually a classical natural lawyer. But it seemed to be in the 20th century debates, which eventually produced so-called new natural law, had already been sort of brewing. And the codification of a central part of so-called classical natural law was given the title perverted faculty argument. I've never used this argument in my own, never used this phrasing in my own defense and explanation of natural law, because it makes it seem as though the argument stands alone, as though it's a sort of demonstration of the morality or immorality of a particular act. Now, what is the perverted faculty argument? It's the idea that acting in accord with our appetites is morally good, and acting in a way that frustrates our appetites is bad. Now, I would never try to persuade a person on the street that lying is bad and start here. Lying is bad because it's unnatural. It frustrates your appetite for communication. I wouldn't start there because it's got so much baggage, so much background, that yes, it's an argument, but it's an argument that is assuming a whole lot.
Mhm.
And so better, I think, is just to say, well, look, this is a natural, maybe perverted faculty analysis, and that sort of PFA is good. A perverted faculty analysis is just going to be a natural law analysis of action. So natural law sees our actions as being good when they satisfy our appetites, because satisfying our appetites is an essential constituent of happiness. Happiness is a function of the satisfaction of the appetites, and an action is good insofar as it's conducive to happiness, since our happiness as human beings is dependent upon satisfying the appetites. Frustrating our appetites is always going to be a bad action, an action that goes against our happiness. Now, so that's the broader natural law explanation. Why does it matter that you're frustrating an appetite of yours? It matters because happiness matters, and morality is about attaining to happiness. And so, without seeing the broader context and just jumping into its unnaturalness or its frustration of an appetite. I mean, this is similar to the last question, because a lot of people are going to say, well, look, the appetites of their body are just the dictates of some detached part of myself. Why consider it something that's important to me, especially if I am this sort of disembodied soul that's using my body as a sort of puppet instrument of satisfaction? But if you see your own person as being more intrinsically related to your body, then the appetites that arise from your animal and human nature more broadly are appetites that need to be taken seriously. Okay, so all that is context, why I typically avoid the phrase perverted faculty argument. Nowadays, you'll almost always hear this in the context of critics of natural law, critics of especially classical natural law. So the objections can get a little bit tricky, but some of them, I mean, you can get a back and forth going pretty easily. There are certain powers that are episodic and certain powers that are not. I think it's easiest to see that certain powers that are episodic produce the good in a particular episode, and that they have, therefore, a functionality that is directed in the moment or within the episode of producing a good. So an easy example here is either sex or communication. Communication is episodic insofar as, like, I assert sentences or propositions, which are discrete things, and those either do or don't accord with my mind. And since communication is designed to reveal my thoughts, each, as it were, unit, episode, discrete object of my communication needs to be in keeping with the appetite. Now, there's certain other powers which are non-episodic, which are in some sense constantly functioning. And so production of sweat is one of these. It's not exactly a natural appetite in the same way, or put differently, it's what is sweat doing? It's cooling my body down. And it's going to do that all the time, anytime I get hot. It's not clear that there is a frustration of a genuine appetite in selectively reducing the amount of sweat in some area, particularly considering that the rest of the body's sweat glands will continue to produce sweat and cool down one's body. Would it be morally impermissible to take antiperspirant and rub it down every inch of your body without qualification? I don't think so. That'd be weird. It's hard to know that would actually be a frustration of an appetite. And here I think the discreteness of the non-episodic character of this power is one of the reasons why a temporary halt for the sake of some other purpose is permissible, because the good it's in some sense constantly being produced. And so it can then function in a moment subservient to some higher function. So the higher function of antiperspirant is obviously to get along in society without making people pass out. And so to me, the subservience of this lower power to a higher power is straightforward. I think chewing gum is an even easier example. Sometimes people talk about chewing gum. To me, it's producing saliva. It's participating in the ordinary gastrointestinal process without frustrating anything. It doesn't deliberately frustrate any particular end of eating. In fact, it is good for oral health. And sugar-free gum is the trickier example, because you think, well, there's no caloric intake, but salivating is itself healthy and positive for oral health, which is why it's common for dentists to recommend sugar-free gum, among other. I've talked for a while, Gavin, so I don't know if you want to jump in here.
Yeah. So it seems to me, I mean, that's just presentation of the natural law view, and generally that phrase "perverted faculty argument," as you point out, tends to be used by critics for rhetorical purposes mainly, rather than for philosophical purposes. And when you get deep down into the philosophy of it, you realize that there's a metaphysics here, that things have certain natures, fulfillment of such natures leads to happiness, and all the rest of that, as you described. But one thing that you talked about the deodorant example. Would it be morally impermissible to cover your whole body in antiperspirant so that you would stop sweating?
At least for an hour.
Right. So that's an interesting one. I mean, I have no firm sort of conclusion on that, but I suppose if you're doing it with the intention to stop yourself from sweating completely all over, I would tend towards the view that that's something that you really ought not to do. But what I wanted to ask you, because this is an interesting one, so it seems you seem to be acting with the intention of trying to frustrate a natural process, which is for your own good. But here's a situation that I wonder about the moral permissibility of it. You take a fighter who needs to cut weight, okay? So assuming that what they're doing in preparing for a fight, that the fight is morally permissible. So let's say it's a sport and, it's an exercise of skill and all that, and they're cutting weight for a fight. And one of the ways of cutting weight is not only a water cut, but also to sweat it out of you as well as part of that water cut. Is doing a water cut like that, and especially, sitting in a heated room with, lots of jackets on in a sauna to encourage sweating to lose weight, is there something morally impermissible in that? You're not exactly frustrating a natural faculty, but you're, in a sense, you're overworking it and using it in a way that it's not meant to be used for. And that seems to be closer to, some of the, issues for which natural law reasoning is deployed, that you're using the faculty in a kind of a way that's not meant to be used for, especially in, particular issues in sexual ethics. So it's kind of water cutting in the same sort of ballpark there.
No, Gavin, this comes close to home, because I used to do wrestling in high school,
right.
And I was always overweight.
Right.
I think it was like a 135 weight class, if memory serves. And I remember putting on dark sweats. I grew up in Texas. It's hot. Jogging all around suburban neighborhood, trying to sweat just as much as I possibly could. To me, what's going on here is it can get a little bit complicated. So at first glance, it seems like, well, no, what you're doing is just, eliciting a normal reaction, subservient to a higher good, much like surgery would be for the sake of a higher good. And so you are, in some sense, putting lesser goods and processes at the mercy of higher goods and processes. So in the case of surgery, obviously you are destroying cells, and you are creating a large inflammatory reaction on the part of the body, and there could be reasons why surgery shouldn't be done, you might think of like completely unnecessary surgery. I've heard of people who will, I don't know, there's probably a name for it, but they'll take massive like hooks, like fishing hooks, and they'll put it through their backs, and they will go suspended. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but one could think that that's immoral because there is no higher good, a proportionately higher good that destruction of lower goods is being subserved under. Whereas the sweating or cutting, to me, it seemed like, okay, so the ontology of the powers, obviously we've got a power to sweat. The power to sweat appears to be for the sake of human health, but the human health is itself subservient to broader human goods. If for some reason being slightly unhealthy would actually make me live a better, like, so for instance, one can imagine that I live in an immoral country. Let's say I live in Nazi Germany, and during the Nazi occupation, every able-bodied man is required to become a Nazi soldier. And I discover that, given some genetic tendencies, that if I were to merely partake in some activity a little bit more, I would be disabled from becoming a soldier, a Nazi soldier. Now, the activity, let's say I smoke a little bit more, and then it causes such severe lung problems. It causes sufficiently strong lung problems that I can't run a 40-yard dash, and this is a requirement for active soldiers. Let's imagine. It seems perfectly permissible then for me to smoke a little bit extra, because health is itself a good subservient to higher goods, namely my, I mean, it's all supposed to be constitutive of happiness, but the contribution that different goods make is different. And so the higher powers always take priority. To me, it seems like it would be fine to smoke in this case. In fact, maybe morally required. Well, how does that relate to sweating? The ontology of the powers there is, sweating is for the sake of health, but health is itself subservient to these broader goods. If smoking a little bit extra, causing some harm to my health, slight harm to my health, for the sake of great goods, is permissible. If it's like a sort of surgery, then to me it seems analogous to sweating for the sake of losing weight. That you're just putting your I don't even think it's harming health, because there could be health benefits in, like, I've heard especially Nordic countries love saunas as endorphin releasing, like it's almost the same as like getting exercise. But let's suppose that all that was false and it just made you sweat a bunch and feel miserable. Still, it seems permissible in this way, like analogous to surgery or taking some slight harm to one's health to avoid, these consequences.
Could I push back a wee bit on that?
Yes, please do.
How do you avoid then the charge that you're permitting something which is maybe not so much the sweat example, because I can see where you're going with that, although I might have a few things to say with that, but I was interested in your smoking example. How do you avoid the charge then that you're permitting something which is in itself ethically impermissible for some good end?
Permitting harm to health?
Yeah, through smoking. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think of harms to health as being intrinsically wrong.
Something like smoking?
I think smoking is wrong.
Intrinsically?
But I don't.
Yeah.
Well, what I should say is, as a former pack-a-day smoker, when I think of smoking cigarettes, I think of the sort of ordinary heavy smoking that would be, say, common in the United States. I don't think that's morally permissible. Because other things being equal, we have a moral obligation to care for our health because of our health's essential contributive promotion of happiness. It's harder, but not impossible to be happy with poor health. And so I think that it creates duties on us, other things being equal duties, ceteris paribus duties, to care for our health. Now, eating bacon, smoking a pipe or a cigar, I have heard, although I can't believe it, that smoked meat is also carcinogenic. or grilled meat is carcinogenic. I refuse to believe it.
Sorry, but maybe if just focusing on smoking itself, the carcinogenic effects of tobacco, so well established that, I mean, you could draw an analogy of smoking with the ingestion of poison, which is slightly. Sorry.
So Gavin, your concern here, just to kind of highlight the issue, is it sounds like you're worried. How do we avoid consequentialism, right?
Yeah.
How do we preserve, which I think we all want to preserve, the intrinsically evil act that just cannot be glossed over or permitted regardless of any circumstances, right? Yeah. So I mean, if smoking isn't obvious enough, just swap in another example there, right?
Yeah, I suppose I want to say that, smoking is an intrinsically morally impermissible act, whereas because I think that the research is so clear on tobacco of its links of its carcinogenic effects that one has to say that, any sort of, engagement with smoking is morally impermissible.
Really? Even a single cigar, Gavin?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I wouldn't go that far. And my reasoning would be largely based on the principle of double effect. So I'd say it's permissible to drink something that's very, very slightly toxic. And that this is usually a matter of degree, since toxic elements are omnipresent. It's usually FDA or whatever regulatory agencies, they'll only allow, I think there's even some requirement of only a certain amount of feces allowed in, say, food. So it's always a matter of degree. And then, of course, the idea is, well, what's the degree and what's determining it? Now, I do think that we have obligations to care for our health, but they're not overriding reasons that require us to never do anything that is even slightly unhealthy. So the principle of double effect reasoning, for those listeners who are unfamiliar with it, is the idea is that some actions we recognize have bad effects, but the actions in certain circumstances, despite the known bad effects, can remain okay. Easy example is driving to work. I drive to work, I pollute the atmosphere. My intention is not to pollute the atmosphere, but it's a side effect, an unavoidable side effect of my driving to work. Well, I think smoking a cigar, a single cigar, let's say you don't smoke them that often, and so the risk to one's health is there, but it's not overriding. My intention is not to put my health at risk, although this is what makes my example right now slightly different from intentionally smoking as a means to avoiding Nazi soldier requirements. But in just ordinary cases of smoking a cigar, my intention is not to harm my health. I'm not taking greater pleasure in the harm to my health. And so it's not that the good I intend is coming about by means of some bad effect. And then the last is there a sufficiently serious reason to allow the bad effect? And here I'd say one of the classic rules of thumb is that the more distant and unlikely an effect, the less serious a reason one would need. For a pack-a-day smoker, it's not that distant and unlikely. In fact, it's pretty likely, although it's hard to know exactly what the time frame would be, 20, 30 years. For a single cigar, the likelihood is, it certainly will raise my statistical likelihood, but it's only going to raise it by a significantly lesser degree. And it's hard to know exactly what the timeline would be. 50 years from now, I might be slightly more disposed to cancer. And I'd say that's a risk that one is permitted to take.
So let me
maybe.
Yeah, you go ahead first, Gavin, and then now that's funny. Not that we can't throw each other just softballs all day long, can we? Right?
I suppose I think I see what you're saying. The degree that the risk has, and you point out the FDA and how much feces and insects or whatever can be in your food. Yeah. You take you compare sort of smoking with alcohol. Okay, so both of them are toxic to a certain degree, but I think the difference with certain toxins is that there's a certain amount of the toxin that you can take before it starts damaging your body. So that so it's well known with alcohol. There's a certain amount of that toxin that you can take before it starts damaging your liver. And then, if I'm right in thinking, I may be wrong on the science, but I think it's correct that your liver actually can be damaged to a certain degree, but it can actually start repairing itself if given, due time and abstinence. So, I mean, that's one thing to consider with regard to certain toxins like alcohol, that there's a certain amount before they are toxic and damaging. Whereas with something like tobacco, so far as I understand the science, and I think this would be an important consideration, with something like tobacco, there isn't that buildup before it starts to become toxic and damaging. It's immediately damaging. As soon as it is taken into the body, it immediately starts to have damaging effects. And I think that's a key difference in the two cases, that you can have degrees with something like alcohol and even, awful as it sounds, feces or bugs in your food, because there's a certain level after which then it's unhealthy. Whereas with something like tobacco, I don't think there's a certain level, because it's immediately having damaging effects on your body.
So that's interesting, because then the moral question is really an empirical question, right?
Well, it'll rest on empirical issues.
It'll rest on empirical issues. Brian, I'll let you respond to that, but then I also want you to respond to mine.
And I'll not come back after your responses.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is fun.
Well, hold on. Let me throw mine on top there, because just swap smoking with lying. Right. What's the principal difference there? Why not just lie to the Nazi officers that I have a lung issue, for example?
Yeah. Well, with lying, it's much more clear that you're directly frustrating a natural appetite. And the reason why is because you're using a natural power of yours in an unnatural way. The power is, especially with communication, it's very discreet. So it's just very straightforward. How do you communicate? You communicate, you achieve the object of your appetite by revealing what's in your thoughts. And so for lying, it's much more straightforward how you're frustrating an appetite by deliberately acting in a way that's not going to achieve the end for the sake of which one's acting. With, like, let's say eating bacon or eating things that are mildly unhealthy, you're not deliberately, as it were, acting in a way that's out of accord with eating. Here would be an act that would be deliberately out of accord with eating if you, people have told me about the show. I don't know that I'll ever watch it, but it's a show called My Strange Addiction, and people will just eat some weird stuff. Glass, powdered concrete, dirty diapers, it's nasty stuff. Well, they're clearly an act of eating that's going against the object, which is nutrition. Now, smoking a cigar or a pipe, it's a little bit different, because there it's not consumption in the same sense. It's not going through the gastrointestinal tract, although some is absorbed in the stomach. But to me, it seems like I don't know that it's going to be as simple as, if direct damage is done, impermissible. If the body allows a certain amount of it, it's permissible. One of the things that I think of as a counterexample is intense exercise causes cell death. And so the damage is direct. In fact, that seems to be the point of exercise, is causing a certain amount of muscular damage. That seems to be the direct method for the muscular health. And so, when I work out, I want to do as much damage as I can. And so, and the damage is, like, the more damage I do, the better off the exercise was. And so now, of course, what you're going to say in response is that damage seems clearly related to producing a positive effect, but still, it seems like here, the analog is the damage that tobacco does is also related to a positive effect, namely pleasure. You don't like it. So supposing I was just exercising for the endorphins, then it seems like I'm causing cell death for pleasure.
Right. So I guess in the exercise world, we often differentiate between a eustress and distress, right? So the idea there is there does come a point with exercise where you've done too much damage, and now you've kind of turned the other way around, and that's where we want to say, even not just for moral reasons, even though we would argue there's a synthesis here, like, no, you should stop, right? you should stop. Like this isn't good anymore. And so I think, yeah, you've already hinted at this, and we don't need to stay on this too long, but I think it's a really the ethical stuff is really fascinating, right? Because it gets murky quick. It just seems somewhat obvious that the damage we're doing with exercise is well established as generally a eustress, right? Up to a reasonable, responsible point, right? Directly related to the exercise for the body, for bodily health. Is that analogous to smoking in any way? And I saw Gavin shaking his head.
Well, I'm not saying it's a close analogy. Please be clear. I don't think
all my fitness people are gonna be
freaking.
My fitness people are gonna be freaking out right now. But no, I'm not putting those words in your mouth. I'm going to let you two continue this exchange for one more minute because that beer has run right through me. So you guys keep going.
All right, Gavin, since I saw you shaking your head, I'll let you have the next word.
I promised I wouldn't respond, but you brought up exercise. It just seems to me that the damage which is caused by exercise, the body is such that it bounces back from it. The body has evolved to grow stronger from the damage produced by exercise. It doesn't seem to me that the body overcomes the damage produced by tobacco. In fact, it succumbs to the damage produced by tobacco, and it can't repair itself.
Well, part of the problem is that, I'm not up on the science, the mechanisms of damage. One of the reasons why cancer is so damaging is because it increases the likelihood of cancer. But what are the mechanisms by which it increases the mechanism of cancer? Here's like completely uninformed. I'm sure there's someone who knows better than I am that's just rolling their eyes. But here's one way that every time the body tries to bounce back, it rolls the dice in its cellular response in cell production, so that every time it's bouncing back, the risk of mutation or some sort of cellular poor response goes up. And so if so, then it seems like the body's bouncing back. We just know that the body bounces back more poorly in the case of some stressors and better in the case of other stressors. And so this is going to be a matter of degree. And I'm not going to say there's going to be an easy principled way to... I don't think smoking occasionally is going to be bad. I think this is principal double effect reasoning. To me, I don't think the avenue by which we can cut off smoking because of direct damage is an easy one. Most of this is going to be a matter of degree. And I do think it's permissible to take some health losses for the sake of goods that are proportionate.
Yeah. I suppose, the body can bounce back in an unhealthy way, say a carcinogenic way.
Yeah.
And the body can bounce back in a healthy way, say by getting stronger, better cardiovascular health and all that. I think that's not a difference. I don't think that's a difference of a degree. I think it's a difference in kind. One is...
What about nitrates? So bacon, lunch meat.
Don't ruin my dinner plans.
Yeah. So if nitrates are such, like tobacco, that for any amount of nitrate that you take, there is a carcinogenic effect.
And that does seem to be what the evidence indicates.
And so if that is, as well established as with something like smoking, then there is a moral problem there.
Interesting. So there could be a moral case against eating charred fatty meat then.
Don't say that, Pat. Please.
Man, your Texas culture is just really taking some body blows right here. Well, all right. So for the fun thing about moral questions like this is everyone's going to have different opinions on it, which I welcome. So comment below if you guys feel like you have some ways to approach this. But yeah, is this a problem for natural law, or is this just a problem of empirical murkiness, or like where are the issues here? Help us with that, right? Because some people would say it seems like some people might get disappointed. It's like it seems like natural law maybe can't handle these things. Is that really what's going on, or what do you think is the way we should frame this?
Yeah, so the framing, I think, is going to be a disagreement between Gavin and I about how health is functioning in, I'm seeing this as a good naturally produced in this non-episodic way, produced commonly through our contributions, but not something where we discreetly activate the power and can therefore frustrate it in using it against its particular end. I think that there may be some disagreement about how health is functioning in natural law, but the worst case scenario is just two different versions of natural law, or Gavin just convinces me that health is more intrinsic, and more an intrinsic good like truth telling than I had initially regarded it as. Now I'm skeptical. I think that natural law doesn't treat health in the same way, that it's a good and it's a contributive good to our happiness, but it's something like ceteris paribus good. It's a contributive good, and it's always a matter of degree. We do have duties because of its contributive nature to take care of it, but they're not overriding duties, according to which we can't take any health losses, even small ones for health gain, for other gains.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, go ahead, Gavin. Yep.
I suppose there's going to be a mixture of philosophical and empirical issues here. I think empirically speaking, the question is, just how well established is the carcinogenic effects of smoking and the carcinogenic effects of nitrates and all the rest. And then what you do with that empirical material will depend on how you frame the natural law, how the philosophical issues pan out. I do think there's maybe some sort of, disagreement at the philosophical level here, especially maybe with something like double effect, because as I understand double effect, the principle of double effect works such that so long as what you're striving to perform, the action you're striving to perform is a good action, its foreseeable consequences that you're not striving after, and yet which are bad, are okay. So you have the classic example of, the child about to pull a pot of boiling water down over himself. You push the child out of the way, away from the scalding pot. That's what you were striving after, that the child doesn't get scalded. But as probably a foreseeable response, the child falls and hurts himself. Well, you're not striving to get the child to fall and hurt themselves, but that's a foreseeable consequence. But it seems to me that in the smoking sort of example doesn't quite fit in to double effect in that way, because I think the smoking example would be akin to, let's say, a child has a cut and the cut may be infected. So you can either, put iodine in the cut, or you could take a kettle of boiling water and pour the boiling water over the cut. And so let's say you pour the boiling water over the cut and you scald the child's arm. It seems to me, somebody might want to invoke double effect reasoning there and say, well, I wasn't striving to scald the child. I was striving to clean out the wound. But, any reasonable person will say, well, you ought to have known that would have, scalding is, an intrinsic part of pouring boiling water over something. And I think the smoking case is like that carcinogenic effects are an intrinsic part of smoking and inseparable from the action of smoking.
So there's a point then where it just becomes ridiculous to bring in the idea or the doctrine of double effect. I mean, this is commonly the objection towards people who want to call in double effect for, say, the atomic bombings, for example. It's like, okay, it's like using a sledgehammer to hit a fly off of someone's head. Right. It's just too ridiculous to take seriously. And certainly I think in many cases that's absolutely right. The question is, does it apply to this case with smoking? So I'll let you guys decide how much longer we want to hang on this thread.
All right, Gavin,
it is fascinating. Yeah.
Pat and I just did a podcast on asceticism. So I'll give you a unique counterexample to see what you think about this, because I think it's totally fine. You'll find it in the ascetical literature quite commonly, especially the biography of saints, that they will take the discipline until blood is drawn. To me, that seems like it's perfectly permissible. Here, health is being subjected to spiritual and rational goods, and that the health losses are direct. I mean, once like literally damaging the cells and causing blood loss. So it seems like, on your view, you should be a little bit more antagonistic about this. But I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. So assuming that the aesthetic practices are, justly, applied and all the rest, it seems to me that that's akin to, muscle breakdown when working out, that those sort of aesthetic practices are something that the body does bounce back from. And so they're not intrinsically wrong in themselves, because they don't have an intrinsic connection to, say, the way smoking does to, being carcinogenic and thus leading to death. Or leading to a sort of disease which is deadly, a terminal illness. So those aesthetic practices aren't like sort of pouring the boiling water over the cut, where an intrinsic feature of that is to scald. It seems they're closer to the working out example, that the body can bounce back from those, and so aren't.
I don't know. I think it's pretty much in the middle there.
Well, I mean, I think drawing blood from being whipped isn't deadly when applied in aesthetic practices under the control of a spiritual advisor who, if it's a proper spiritual advisor, would stop the practice if they thought that it was leading to a process whereby death occurs.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, like, it seems like a matter of degree. If you poured boiling, I mean, I don't advocate this as an ascetical practice, but if you poured a little boiling water on your hand, no cut, but something like, well, I don't have a discipline around, so here you go.
Yeah, it seems to me that pouring boiling water wouldn't be a kind of aesthetical practice, because it wouldn't be like, as I understand aesthetical practices, fasting and whipping, let's say, the classic ones, they're kind of inflicting something on you, from which you bounce back, whereas pouring boiling water is almost an exercise in stamina or endurance. So there seems to me maybe that's why boiling water isn't used in aesthetic practices, because it's contrary to the spirit of such practices.
Yeah,
I don't know. But
yeah.
I feel like maybe we've talked about
we can do. We might have to dedicate a whole episode to double effect at some point. It's one of the. I'm glad I'm not an applied ethicist. I'll simply leave it at that.
Yeah. And I'm just a metaphysician, so
right. It's real quick, Brian. Like, why ethics for you? Why was that the area you wanted to focus on, just from a personal?
Well, one reason why is I have strong moral judgments, and so for me, doing philosophy in the area that I'm the most, that I've got the strongest judgments on, is natural. But then also, as personally, I feel like I was a very bad person, and I also feel like, had I been more properly informed in ethics as a high schooler and as a college student, I might have been a better person. And I feel like ignorance in this area is, some of it was affected ignorance, some of it was deliberately cultivated, turning a blind eye to moral principles, but other parts of it were, I was sincere and I cared, but I thought, from lack of information, that what I was doing is okay. Right. And then I suffered the consequences of that as a person. And so as a sort of drive, it attracts me, the thought that maybe I could, rectify the situation that I myself suffered from.
Right. Yeah. No, that you and me both, brother. It's so funny because the first question we had was on when experts disagree. So here we have a great example, and then old Pat Flynn here could come in with the symmetry breaker and be like, okay, if it comes down to smoking, what could be the symmetry breaker here, right? Well, maybe what do you have to gain from smoking versus what do you have to lose, or something like that. I don't know. Just jamming around here. As somebody who grew up with tremendous amounts of secondhand smoke, but who also has had the occasional cigar. I'm divided. I'm internally divided on this issue. Next question. If you weren't Catholic, what, if any, religion would you be?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, go ahead. You go first, Gavin.
I don't think there is any other religion to be. other than Catholic, because if I wasn't Catholic, then I wouldn't, have affirmed the truth of the matter. And so there is nothing else to be. So if I wasn't Catholic, I would be in a pretty bad state. So I suppose that's how I would answer that question.
Now, Brian, you converted to Catholicism, so would it be a reversion for you, or what do you think about it?
The strange thing is my reaction is not one of I don't think there's a next best truth. I think there's a different object. I think there's probably a different answer than what you or the person who submitted the question would expect. But I think if I was non-Catholic, I think I'd be a devil worshiper or something. I think I'd want to harness the powers of demons to make my life in this world the best that it could be. And so I think I'd be in the occult if I wasn't a Catholic.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Atheism. If you weren't Catholic, as I say, you'd be in a bad state. It would be atheism and full blown, really rigid atheism.
Yeah, for me, so before I became Catholic, I kind of followed that, I guess, typical, I looked pretty seriously into the more sophisticated forms of religious pluralism, right? Would I, if somehow somebody falsified Catholicism for me, which itself is an interesting question, because I think Catholicism is falsifiable in a sense. Like, there's stuff that the church could do, I think, that would cause me to say, oh, I guess I got it wrong, right? Now, I don't think that will ever happen, because I think that the church, the Catholic faith, is true. But it's there. I don't think I could ever go back to so yeah, Gavin, I guess that's usually for you. Like, say the church and full magisterial authority deny the Trinity or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that'd put us in a bad spot, right? I think we could all admit that, that would be, I don't know if I'd want to try and perform the mental gymnastics to try and defend that at that point. You know what I mean? It just seems like that's a clear failure or refutation of the doctrine of indefectibility.
Would you see how that's possible? I don't see how the church could do that. You said that the church could do something which would make you question, Yeah.
So let me clarify. I don't think it will ever happen, because I'm so convinced that this is God's church, right? So I guess
it could happen. Not that it ever will. I don't think it could happen.
Oh, okay. So that's interesting. So you wouldn't even grant the hypothetical then?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just hit a stalemate there. So I guess if I were to go along with the hypothetical and say that did happen, even if it can't happen, would I then abandon would I then lose faith in the Deante argument or something like that? Would I abandon theism outright? I don't think I would, right? I think I would I'd be very confused to say the least, right? I don't think I would know exactly where to turn, but I don't think I would go to outright atheism at that point. That would take significantly more work. So yeah, I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that a single proclamation denying the Trinity, let's say Pope Francis, let's say it's possible that Pope Francis would tomorrow say, turns out we were wrong the whole time. Not only should they get civil unions, but same-sex sexuality is perfectly permissible. It's on par with what natural law has always prescribed. I think this is within the realm of possibility. And I think he could even say, hey, by the way, I'm speaking ex cathedra right now. Listen up. I think this is within the realm of possibility. And this is the reason why, is because for indefectibility to be violated, it's not sufficient that an attempt at teaching be made, but that the church in fact teach. And teaching is a two-way street. So something isn't taught if it's naturally confusing and it fails to be communicated. And so I would say it's possible that initial statements like this could be made, but they would fail to violate indefectibility because people would be so naturally confused. They'd say, huh, what? How's that possible? And there'd be a period of time where people would be trying to reconcile what they had always been taught with what has presently been taught. And I think it's possible that, I think if it were possible that the church would make some, like the Pope or CDF is going to make this awful statement violating clearly the apostolic deposit, I think it's possible that they could do that. But then within the ordinary period of time for any educated person to try to form an informed judgment, the church would clarify itself.
Right. So, well, yeah. So, all right, let me push back on this, because this is a really interesting thing, right? Because I don't know, like, I obviously believe that this will never happen, right? I'm fully Catholic. God protects his church. This wouldn't happen. But just for the sake of entertainment, say there's Vatican III, right? And put civil unions aside, because that's a knotty subject. Let's take something much clearer. Vatican III comes out. We have, the full language that we need for authoritative teaching in there, whatever that is. Wrong about the Trinity, wrong about Christ's divinity, right? Just clear reversal of church teaching. And then this gets reiterated for 50 years. And then there's Vatican IV, and it reiterates it again. Right? Clearly, there has to be some threshold where we admit.
I think
right?
that's impossible. Yeah,
right.
That's an impossibility.
Okay. Yeah. So, but I just want to say, like, I wouldn't want to be in a position to say and just perform endless contortions and say, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's no threat. I think I want to admit, no, there's an extremity where if that happened, I would be willing to say, I was wrong. Yeah. Right? Like, indefectibility has failed. Now, I think we all agree that that is impossible. It will never, in fact, happen. It can happen.
I would say it could not happen.
It could not. So, Gavin, can you expand on that and articulate from your position? Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's interesting, the two beliefs that you guys sort of zoned in on, So, Pat, you zoned in on an article of the Creed, mm-hmm. Whereas Brian zones in on a particular moral teaching, which is well established and has scriptural support and goes to the very heart of the theology of marriage, which goes right back to Christ. So it's not an article of the Creed, but can we say, is it dogmatic? Would it be a dogmatic teaching? I suppose the view on marriage would be dogmatic.
Where's my Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma book?
I mean, I suppose the view on marriage would be dogmatic. So, I mean, there you have two dogmas, one of the Creed and the other of, just well-established scripturally and within the moral tradition of the church. My view would be that given the promise that Christ has made to the church of its indefectibility, there's nothing which is dogmatically held, which at a later date could be said to not be held, or that we could be said to be wrong on. And I think that's just clear about the indefectibility. So anything which we're required to believe as a dogma of the faith, the church can't deny it at any later point with magisterial authority.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that brings up a whole series of interesting questions in the sense that, say that the Vatican III, Vatican IV hypothetical situation happened. Would you just say that, no, the church isn't actually teaching that? Or do you think it wouldn't?
Can't happen?
Or that it just wouldn't even get to that point is what you're saying, right?
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
I would say, I mean, I would be fully committed to the view that couldn't happen. Mm-hmm. I think the best example of that was Humanae Vitae. I think, I mean, that's the clear case of the circumstances around the publication of Humanae Vitae, that we had, what appears to be some sort of providential intervention when everything was saying that, Paul VI was going to, go the other way on this, and just miraculously he didn't. Even up to that, and I'm told, of stories of priests in parishes, training people on how to use these new contraceptives. Mm-hmm. And now these are just stories, so it could be hearsay, but these are, people, of a certain generation, and that they're, the particular commission for studying the issue, came out in a majority in favor of, these, of the contraceptive pill. It seems like a clear case that here's a point when Christ actually kept his church on the straight and narrow with Humanae Vitae. Right. So I would say something of the same would happen if we had, a Vatican III, and it seemed that, everything was pointing in this direction. And then I would say when the documents come out, you would see that, we don't violate, what we've held dogmatically.
Right. And I certainly agree with that. Right. Mm-hmm.
I agree with that too, but I think that we also have an example of what I mentioned in the catechism changes regarding the death penalty, as well as some clarification. It's unclear to me, but that's the whole point, with the dismissal of just war theory in the most recent encyclical. To to me, what's going on here is there are apparent contradictions with the tradition, but they're so confusing, they're so unclear that no one can be taught. And so there's no, it's as though, I mean, I don't want to be uncharitable to Pope Francis. It's as though someone were teaching this, but their words got muffled, right? And it certainly sounds a lot like heresy. It sounds a whole lot like a rejection of some part of the deposit, but it's not as like wonderful and clear as Humana Vitae. It's like it's as though instead of Humana Vitae, the Pope wanted to say contraception was okay, but then he muddled his words, and so rather than upholding the tradition, there was an apparent rejection of the tradition, but it was so confusing and unclear that reasonable people are not actually being taught errors in faith and morality.
Right. So your position is rather than God correcting him and making him say the right things, he essentially got a sock put in his mouth.
Yeah, something like that. That every time the church teaches faith and morality, and teaching involves more than just saying it, that the actual teaching procedure has always failed when errors are being put forward.
Yeah.
Either the vehicle of the error, say an interview with an Italian journalist, the vehicle, like so the denial of the eternality of hell, a belief in annihilation, that the vehicle is just all wrong for teaching the church. Or when the vehicle is all right, like the encyclical or the catechism, it's so muffled and confusing that any reasonable person is going to be scratching their head and trying to come to a legitimate judgment, but are going to be at a loss on how to reconcile these things. And in the meantime, I think the church will clarify, but never actually teach errors.
Right.
I think I would want to distinguish between church documents which are authoritatively magisterial and other church documents which, you know, are saying something, trying to get a point across, but aren't authoritatively magisterial.
Yeah.
I think Humanae Vitae is clearly magisterial because there was an issue about the contraceptive pill. Vatican II says, look, we'll leave this, you know, to a future date. And this is Paul VI coming back and saying, look, this is what the crack is with that. But there are other church documents, encyclicals included, which are given more of a sort of a peroration on a particular issue, but, you know, they're not given any sort of binding teachings, which are de fide on Catholics. And I think certainly you can have those and the teaching can be muffled, but it's just not a magisterial teaching. So again, for me, it's only with magisterial teachings, the teachings of which are de fide, which could never, you know, you can never contradict the deposit of faith. That's why something like an ecumenical council, like Pat's example, which would be very clearly promulgating magisterial teaching, you just couldn't have anything, you know, muffled or contrary to what we hold de fide. Whereas some church documents, some encyclicals can just, you know, sort of be just a wee bit blah and, you know, not be very clear. But that's okay because it's not something teaching magisterial. It's not a magisterial teaching which we're required to hold de fide.
Right. Good stuff.
Does that sort of clarify things?
Does for me. You guys got time for one more?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm here all night. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hey, I'm not in any rush. This is fun. This is a spirited discussion. I love it. All right, I know who sent this question in. It's I'll give him a shout out, Eric Robinson. So he said, Eric wants to say, it seems like philosophies that develop in academia 100 years ago are now the quote air we breathe, and most are not aware of this. What effect would it have to make people aware that their thought process has been radically influenced by these past philosophies? What are philosophies currently being discussed and developed that in 100 years from now could become the normal way of thinking for the world?
Yeah. Who wants to go first?
I can jump in. I've made you the first several times. I think that in academia, maybe we could separate the humanities from philosophy. Philosophy is dominated by a sort of inheritance of logical positivism, especially among analytics. And that is about 100 years old. outside of philosophy, the humanities are dominated not by the inheritance of logical positivism, but rather by Marxist and post-Marxist thought. And so I think in popular culture, Marxism and its errors are much more common. Now, I mean, that said, it's not that old. Marxism is, 150, 200 years old. And so these are new thoughts. But, the whole Marxist idea is new is great, right? It's this Hegelian dialectic turned on its head that, modernity is wonderful because we're now in the present and the dialectic has moved forward. And so on the one hand, it is really new. And on the other hand, it's sort of, it makes itself protected, as it were, from the charge of novelty, because novelty is now great. I don't know if you want to jump in. That's just a partial thought, Gavin, but...
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I agree entirely that it seems to be the philosophical views of, certain thinkers, maybe 2 generations into the past, sort of seep down into the non-philosophical public of today. So the sort of views at the start of the 20th century, which are now more or less abandoned in philosophy, have seeped down into popular culture today. And I would go even further than that. I would say we're still caught within the specter of post-Cartesianism or of just modernism, of the turn to the subject. You ask anybody, just in the world, do you have a mind? Yes. What is your mind? It's this private inner space. It's me. It's the self, all that sort of stuff. And we're just the non-philosophical public are just captivated by that. I think Marxism, again, another sort of philosophical position, is just embedded throughout Western culture, especially, within the non-philosophical reading public. And you find it in a lot of the other humanities subjects and the various offshoots of Marxism, say, for example, in critical theory, which is just driving a lot of public social cultural discussions of various issues. So I think a good dose of philosophy and the history of philosophy would help. I wouldn't say inoculate against that, but it would just help people to see the philosophical progeny of a lot of the things we take for granted, today. Such as, like when I tell people, that your soul isn't immortal. You're the subject of mortality or immortality. Your soul isn't you. And, good, faithful Christians, Catholics, look at me aghast at that idea that, eternal life is bodily life, not the life of some sort of spirit. You are not a spirit. You're a physical substance, things like that, which are just prevalent. And then I think the questioner asked, what sort of things are we reading? What sort of philosophers are we reading and teaching today, which in 100 years will kind of seep into popular culture? I think the return to some of the perennial thinkers that we're seeing in philosophy in the English-speaking world today will sort of seep in, because I think there's a lot of younger generation of philosophers that are having quite an impact on people who are reading the likes of Aquinas and Aristotle and Plato, and are reading, say, in the natural law and virtues, who are having an impact on students who may not, go on to become philosophers, but could be teachers, journalists, politicians, and who may not agree with their teachers, but they will, still retain that influence. And so I think the return to, the classical tradition, or the perennial tradition, as I call it, is, going to have some sort of impact in a few generations.
Right. Which is an optimistic view.
Yeah.
I would add, if I'm going to read the tea leaves, as it were, looking at contemporary trends, then I would predict that the next generation of philosophers will be broadly skeptics, that skepticism will become a dominant philosophical trend, and that indifference and disbelief, not to say outright rejection, but just a sort of skeptical attitude, will be an emerging trend. If I'm going to read the tea leaves based on the broad historical fact that the pendulum seems to swing back and forth, I would say that out of the relativistic tendencies of the maybe later half of the 20th century, we're going to see the pendulum swing towards dogmatism. Now, that's an interesting dynamic, because what you're going to have, what I would see is, on the one hand, dogmatism, and on the other hand, skepticism. And that, I mean, those are natural opposites. And, you know, the current trend towards skepticism may create a dogmatic reaction on the other hand, on the other side anyway. You know, I'd like to think that things would get better, but I would predict a sort of dogmatic versus skeptical dialectic. One thing that may be worth adding too is that different people react differently to history, and thinking about Marxism is a good entry point there. If you've got a philosophy of history where progress is made, where the theme, the arc, is getting closer and closer to the truth, then novelty or newness is actually the essence of you know, what we're looking for. Whereas many people seem to think, and Gavin's point about returning to the perennially significant philosophers, many people don't like to think that their ideas are 10 minutes old. And they like to think that there was a classical wisdom, and to tap into that classical wisdom is, and to, as it were, sort of be able to explain, take advantage of, and to further human wisdom is really significant. And so depending on a person's attitude towards history, knowing that their ideas are really new could be a really great thing or a really bad thing.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that one, Gavin?
I suppose another, you know, sort of issue to take into consideration is that a huge influence on culture, especially modern culture, 19th and 20th century, has been the media. And the media, you know, initially through the newspapers and then through radio and television, has been a carrier for philosophical positions, which the non-philosophical reading public imbibe. But the media now is not just that, but it's also social media. And there is a whole sort of area of social media which is very prevalent in the area of podcasting and blogs, which carries with it the influence of traditionally minded philosophers, which the old media, such as papers, radio, television, just wasn't able to carry over. So it's precisely because people on social media can search out blogs that they find interesting. They can search out podcasts that they find interesting, and they can have an attention span which is longer than the sort of attention span that they would get from a newspaper or radio, because they're being fed something, they haven't searched it out. So you can go to a Joe Rogan podcast and listen to it for 3 hours, or a Pat Flynn podcast, you know, for 3.5 hours, and get a lot of good stuff. And I think that's going to be a driver for the sort of philosophical positions we imbibe, because it gives exposure to the more perennial tradition, which, you know, traditional media maybe didn't give exposure to, and was maybe more favorable to a more Marxist outlook, or a more modernist kind of outlook. Right. That'll be a carrier of, you know, the sort of philosophical positions that we would be sympathetic to in the later culture. Yeah,
the new media has really shaken things up, I think, certainly in mixed ways, but it makes me more optimistic than not in I would say overall. Okay, let's finish with this one, unless you guys because I have stuff here on universalism, annihilationism, intelligent design, some big meaty questions. So maybe we could it'll give me a reason to bug you guys to come back on for another roundtable. But here's one that I get a lot. Because Gavin, I know. Wait, was it today that you already did a 2.5 hour podcast?
I did 2.5 hours this morning. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we cannot keep you here all night.
I had a can of Monster. I'm fine.
All right.
At least it wasn't with Tom Jump.
Brian, oh my gosh, Brian, how are you on time? You all right?
Yeah, this should be our last question.
All right, let's make this last one. This is a very common one, so people will be interested in both of your thoughts on this, I'm sure. Are Stoicism and Christianity compatible? This one is in my Instagram inbox at least once a month. This one.
So if I may just offer an initial thought on that, Aquinas in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, he tends to kind of, compare the Stoics and the Aristotelians, at least early on in the commentary, and he shows where the disagreement lies, but then he tries to downplay the disagreement. It seems to me that the difference between the Stoics and Christians is that the Stoics want to suppress all feeling or all sort of passionate response to any situation. What's that we got there? The Stoic philosophy of Seneca. Yeah. So sorry, that was a murder image, Pat. So I had to do a bit of murder.
Yeah, that was pretty good. Yeah. So I've got Seneca in my hand. He was just lying around, so kind of convenient. Yep. Sorry,
Yeah,
Gavin.
It seems to me that the Stoics want to suppress the passions and the passionate response to something in order that they may kind of, enter some sort of, higher state by which they can control their reactions to things. So I think that that's that classical, sort of, view. Is it Epictetus that, you can't control the things that happen to you. You can only control your response to things. And that's kind of how you need to live. And that involves suppressing any sort of passions that you have. The Christian view is that you need passions in order to live as the kind of animal that you have. And to live the good moral life, you bring those passions under the control of your reason. In other words, you're reasonable in the exercise of your passions, and so you develop virtues so that you can be temperate and courageous and all the rest. So it seems to me that there is an incompatibility between Stoicism and Christianity there, such that Christians will embrace their passions, but the Stoics will try to deny their passions.
Christianity is compatible with every truth because, truth doesn't contradict truth. And I'm trying to think about what's unique about Stoicism that's true and what's not. Stoics were preeminent natural lawyers. And so for that, they're to be commended. I mean, they're really developed and enhanced the idea that to act morally is to act in accordance with nature. And so there's a lot of insights in the Stoic tradition that I think are really admirable. Now, I was trying to think about maybe one of the unique theses of Stoicism is that our moral and practical judgments are made worse when passions affect them and made better when passions are detached from them. It's not to say that we can't have the passions, but that we shouldn't allow them to influence our judgment, that we should keep them distinct and separate. And then I'm trying to think about what about Christianity would deny that. Now, I think that, so on the one hand, just a broad philosophical tradition has tended to be much more Aristotelian, much more positive about the body and its passions. And one reason why is because we're not Gnostics, right? And we think of the body as being an essential part of who we are. And that certainly is part of Christianity and not just a ancillary connected philosophical position. But then I was trying to think about what other ways in which the passions or the emotions would actually be negatively affected if you were to distance yourself from them. And what comes to mind is Teresa of Avila's recommendations about prayer are very, very strongly effective. That one of the rules of thumb for prayer is that it should produce some affect, and that this is true even when you exit the sort of meditative states and enter into deeper contemplative states, as affect is still a dominant driving force. And so if I could see that practical judgments would be made worse if you paid no attention to your affect and to your passionate responses to meditative subjects and only thought rationally and deliberatively, this would actually be a worse form of prayer according to the mystical doctors. And so to me, it seems like although one could be a Christian disregarding all his passions or her passions, I don't think that they would be a very good Christian. I think that you could sort of like soften it in a way that wouldn't make you just straightforwardly Gnostic and anti-body. But even then, I think that softened position in ordinary spiritual life is not going to be as robust as a tradition that embraces who we are as human beings, but as Gavin said, tames our passions using reason.
Right. I guess the only other thing I would add, as somebody who was interested in the Stoics and read a lot of the Stoics before I became Catholic is just be Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what? Like there's nothing, there's nothing you're gonna find in Stoicism that you're not gonna find better, truer, and more beautiful as a Catholic. If you just want my most straightforward answer, and I say that in sincerely, seeing that Stoicism seems to be a spiritual stepping stone for people, especially in today's culture. And I think that the reason Stoicism has become so popular again, it has. I mean, there's all these best-selling Stoic books right now, is because of this deep spiritual poverty our culture's in. And there's something that just seems acceptable in a secular sense about Stoicism. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the central themes of Stoicism is also a central theme of Buddhism, but it has far better expression in Catholicism, and that is detachment. Detachment is, I think people are gobbling up Stoicism, not simply because of a vacuum, but also because the world sucks and we want a philosophy that explains why we shouldn't get too worked up about it. And so detachment is, I think, the big draw there. And but detachment is not an end in itself. We're detached, and we should see rationally that it's worth getting detached from a world that's falling apart. But primarily so that we could become more attached to a good that is greater and more permanent. And so detachment makes far more sense. The idea of ceasing to desire things that are in fact worthless makes more sense than saying just detach from everything or desire nothing.
Right. It seems to me that one of the key benefits of Stoicism is this notion of self-mastery, and overcoming oneself in the pursuit of some sort of good. And that the likes of, your Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan phenomena, that people are just, so many young men are just, kind of really devoted to, carries that message of self-mastery, which, brings with it responsibility, which is a huge feature of the Christian life, of mastering oneself, and engaging in the drama, of salvation, and sort of, salvation is something that God does, but you have to cooperate with that, and you have to dispose yourself through the virtues to enjoy salvation and engage in the drama of salvation. All of that, that it's kind of, it's adventurous, and that's something that a lot of young men especially are seeing with the Jordan Peterson thing, but also with Joe Rogan and a lot of those other popular figures that are attracting people of a Stoic type. You find that in Catholicism as well. So it is like a gateway to Catholicism.
Yeah, and it's Peterson's back. God bless him. I hope he's doing well.
Yeah.
So, good stuff, guys. What a great roundtable. This has been really fantastic. Really enjoyed this. I hope the listeners do as well. Before we say goodbye, let's get the good word in about your works. Here's Brian's book, Introduction to Ethics. Definitely pick this one up. This is I recommend this and Right and Reason, Dr. Bisong, I think, are my two top for people looking for good introduction.
And readers might enjoy the fact that on the theory I put forward, they can continue to eat bacon and smoke a cigar at least occasionally.
We'll hash that one out in greater detail. Gavin, I usually have your book down here to showcase, but it's actually up on my desk right now because I've been citing it so much in that paper. I've been writing. But Aquinas' Way to God, Metaphysics of Creation, we'll link those in the show notes. Brian, you go first, then Gavin. Anything else you want to mention? Anything coming up, your websites, recent articles you've written? Just put the word out about anything and everything.
Yeah, right now, nothing. There's some stuff in the pipeline, but nothing that interesting that your listeners would want to look at. But you can always stay up to date with stuff I'm doing by visiting my website, which is bbsong.weebly.com. And I upload my papers there, and you can be connected to all the stuff that I'm doing through the website.
Kevin?
Yeah, so I've got a paper on existential inertia forthcoming. I've got a paper for a fetch shrift forthcoming, which, wherein I argue that there's a particular way to God in Aquinas, which, is his way to God. There's a paper on the transcendentals forthcoming as well. And then there's another paper in the pipeline on God's existence in nature in the Summa Contra Gentiles, which I'm working on. So they're all in the pipeline. I've just completed a manuscript on the 5 ways. It's in submission. Doesn't mean it'll get published, but it's a manuscript and it's in submission, so it's there anyway. And I'm working on the resurrection book. 10,000 words in, and working on faith, and faith is a virtue, and going through all of that. So keeping busy in that respect. Always available if anybody wants to make any inquiries about doing doctoral work with me. Happy enough, for that, and we can talk through that. And anything else you want to know, you can find me on my staff page in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth.
Beautiful. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you.